Welcome to another edition of Mystic Skeptic Radio's Raiders of the Unknown. In this episode, our guest is Ken Ami. He's a long-time independent researcher and lecturer on issues pertaining to worldview philosophies and various sorts of religions, and has specialized in systematic biblical paranormology. He has posted thousands of articles on his website and has been published in Apologetics Journal and interviewed in many radio shows and podcasts. Today's topic is the ongoing debate over the Nephilim, which some people call giants in the book of Genesis and in other parts of the Bible. And this conversation started as I was challenging the well-known perspective of our previous guest, who passed away a couple of years ago, Mr. Michael Heiser. He was a Christian theologian and author who made a living proposing that his interpretation, which is similar to some, patriarchs of the church and people like that, that there was such a thing as half man, half demon people laying around. And then the souls of those individuals came back at the time of Jesus, has become popular among evangelical Christians. And from a rational Jewish perspective, I found a lot of problems with that. But we want to see what Mr. Ken Ami has written about it. He has many books out there, including What Does the Bible Say About Giants and Nephilim, styled Giantology and Nephology, The Apocryphal Nephilim and Giants, Encountering Nephilim and Giants in Extra-Biblical Texts, and the Scholarly Academic Nephilim and Giants, What Do Scholarly Academics Say About Nephilim Giants? So again, thank you, Mr. Ken Ami, for being on the show.
Shalom Aleichem. Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your interest in this topic. I read your article debunking Michael Heiser. He had put a quest on his blog to have somebody challenge him on his what he thought was very thought out theology, and a lot of it comes across in his book Reversing Herman and the Hidden Realm, one of those. So how would you counter his opinion on that topic?
Well, so to begin with, my interests, I don't actually recall how I first got interested in this issue, but what would typically happen nowadays in our modern age is somebody becomes interested in something and they go online and search for it, right? So inevitably, if you go online and you search for Nephilim or giants, you're never inevitably going to end up in modern nephology, or what I term pop nephology, which means that it's going to be 99.9% unbiblical, what I call neo-theo sci-fi tall tales. That's what you're going to encounter out there. And so I was going along with it because, frankly, why not? I hadn't studied the issue myself, and the presenters, the pop researchers, are very exciting to listen to. And their tall tales are just very exciting, very interesting, very mysterious. And one day I just ran across a little comment on to a video, and it just said something as simple as, yeah, I used to go along with what these guys were teaching, but then I searched it out for myself and I found that it wasn't quite so. And that got me thinking, well, okay, I guess I got to start looking at this issue for myself as well. And that's why I came to conclude that modern nephology is unbiblical neo-theo sci-fi tall tales. Now, that doesn't mean I disagree with all of it. But the way that Michael Heiser made his way into this is interesting because he's one of the few scholars who has come down from the ivory tower and really engaged the common person. So that's really important when scholars do that, because scholars tend to write scholarly works that are meant for other scholars. If you've ever read a dissertation or peer-reviewed journal papers, it's very, very informative, but it can be very difficult, uninteresting reading. And so people like Heiser, what they do is they also write popular level books and papers to express to the common person what the scholars are talking about or uncovering in their research. So that's how part of how Michael Heiser made a name for himself at the pop level, right? And so what was interesting to observe is that the pop nephologists thought, boy, they had found their golden guy. He was going to be their golden boy, backing up all of their tall tales. And he's an academic. So now they had that behind him. And it just didn't really happen that way. And I was there. I mean, I was hearing it live happening of them telling him, hey, is this the case? Is that the case? And he would feel, no, not really. No, it doesn't quite work that way. So it was kind of interesting that, yeah, he would back up some of what they had to say, but definitely not once they would go like full-blown sci-fi tall tales. So it was really interesting to witness that going on. Then this took obviously a few years. And what's interesting too is, yes, as you mentioned, Heiser passed away over a year ago, but he's still putting out videos every single week on YouTube posthumously. So it's really interesting that somebody had recorded enough of his lectures that there's still material coming out regularly. Okay, so now what's interesting about him and what I think he would agree with me on is that he was credentialed and he was experienced, and there's no question about that. And I certainly learned a lot from him. But another thing we would agree on is that he was not infallible, of course. And when it comes to nephology and when it comes to demonology, I would say that those were weak points in his research and quite easily demonstrable at that. His angelology, I would tend to agree with more, besides maybe some category errors. But what did you? I don't know if I know I answered the first part of your question. What do you want to specify about the second part? Do you want to get directly into the nephology or demonology or angelology?
Before we do that, let me tell you my perspective and my disappointment with Dr. Heiser. He was very charitable to share 2.5 hours of his time with us, and we did a show on the UFO phenomena and one about a better interpretation of Christian scriptures, because there was a Christian white supremacist who shot up a synagogue in California, and I challenged him to come and give us why would a traditionalist Christian do that. But the problem I had with him was that in his evangelistic efforts, and this is where it gets kind of dicey, where someone can be a scholar and a devout Christian at the same time. My perspective is different than yours. Instead of him challenging some of the pop and fantastical perspectives, I think he fed into them. I don't know if it was to sell more books or because he actually believed this, but at one point he had some Christian ministers from two different groups, and they were saying that they had some type of deliverance method to get people off of human trafficking and some type of sexual violence trauma through prayer and intercession and charismatic perspectives and things like that, which to me sounded a lot like the satanic panic. And it had a lot to do with his ongoing, what he thought was a New Testament theology that Christians are able to cast out demons and the demons are still around and there's people who are half demon. And to me, that's when it got very silly. And it went away from the basic premise that he had, which I thought was a little arrogant, that he was one of the best interpreters of scripture because he understood the languages of that time. So then bringing it to the modern world, he made himself an authority on the right reading of all very complicated and very strange passages of serpents and seraphs and all kinds of demons. And then if you look at his angelology, it was very Greco-Roman and very almost Byzantine and Catholic when it came down to his view of where every supernatural being landed. So I don't know what's your perspective on that in relation to how he popularized a very, like, in my eyes, kind of insidious way of finding a demon under every rock.
Yes, I see what you're saying. Now, I have written right around a dozen books on nephology. So I'll admit that when it came to Heiser, I was just focused on the data he was presenting on those issues. And I really can't say anything about his other interests, such as involvement in deliverance ministries or anything like that. Because my focus was, my research was very focused, put it that way. So anything that wasn't dealing with the biblical text or apocrypha or pseudepigrapha, I wasn't really paying attention to what he was doing or saying otherwise. And especially since when I dove into this research, it was just a hectic few years where I was just plowing through data, almost over 2 millennia's worth. So if we back up to this, all really, of course, begins with what I call the Genesis 6 affair. And historically, I published an entire book just about who took which view, beginning in BC days with the Jewish texts, up until almost half a millennia into the AD years. And what's known as the angel view was unquestionably the majority view, the original view, and the traditional view. So that would be the view that Nephilim would be half angel and half human. Now, one issue is that there's biblical nephology and then there's other nephology, right? So unfortunately for the pop researchers, biblical nephology is just too boring because what we're told is that they lived pre-flood. They didn't make it past the flood in any way, shape, or form. End of story. That's it. So you can't really get much cachet out of that, right? You can't really run a quote unquote ministry that's going to put out information every single week about that. You can't really do it. So that's part of why somebody would opt for post-flood Nephilim, because then they can just the tall tales are endless, and you can even go as far as claiming that they're still around today. I mean, you can pretty much water everything down and make it appear as if you're connecting data points that are really just not connectable. But that's one of the reasons why people opt for a view that's really not biblical, because the biblical data is just very scant and very boring. Oh my goodness. I mean, how are you going to make it really sexy to put out a video or an article every single week about beings that have been dead and gone for millennia, right? You got to spice it up.
So I read your article responding to Michael Heiser's challenge, and that's what was the gist of the article was the Nephilim were only around before the flood, and after that, any reference to a similar being, it was in comparison or they're monster-like or something like that. And then, but my concern was that as a student of mystical writings, there's still a sense that they are supernatural beings. I don't know how high or how big, but in Enoch and the other extra biblical texts, there's a sense of these mighty beings who are causing spiritual havoc. And, if you read Enoch, it sounds like it's before time or during time, but in some type of cloak of supernatural realm. So how would you locate these beings just to the flood as people expand on the Bible? Because we know that both Christian and Jewish authors created their own homiletical and interpretive texts to make sense of difficult passages in the Bible. So where would they put these mighty ones who are either half angel or complete demons or whatever into the human history that they were portraying.
Yes. Okay. So I might go through this very quickly, and if we need to kind of find some backing for what I'm going to assert, we can do that. But basically, like I said, I have no problem with the view that angels mated with humans and produced Nephilim. The issue of demons is going to come down the line a little bit. So if we have God attempting to be rid of them via the flood, well, guess what? He didn't fail. He didn't miss a loophole. The flood was not much of a waste. That's why there's no such thing as post-flood Nephilim. I mean, 5 times the Bible tells us who survived the flood, and guess what? They're never on any list. The patriarchs, Moishe. I mean, so many people before arriving at the land of Canaan were told who lives in the land, who lives around the land. Nephilim are never mentioned even one single time. We're told of tales of battles and even hand-to-hand combat. Nephilim are never mentioned even one single time. Every place where they should have logically been mentioned, they're never mentioned ever, except that centuries post-flood, some unreliable guys present an evil report and they're rebuked by God. And within one single sentence in that report, they merely assert that they saw Nephilim and that Nephilim are very, very tall. Okay, so bottom line is post-flood nephology and nephology that considered Nephilim to have been really, really, really tall. All of that is literally based on one single, extremely problematic sentence. And I mean, it's logically problematic, it's biologically problematic, it's theologically problematic, it's even textually problematic. So you have this entire cottage industry that has really arisen around one single sentence. And it also creates tons of problems because, again, now you have to explain how God failed, how he missed a loophole, how they got past the flood. And this is when different people literally invent fantasy stories about how that happened. Well, there's zero indication that it happened. There's zero indication that there's a reason to think it happened or invent reasons that it happened. So now Heiser's view is that he accepts post-flood Nephilim, but that they died out shortly after the Exodus move into the land of Canaan. At least he put a stop to them physically. And also in Jubilees, in the book of Jubilees, you also have post-flood Nephilim, but they only survive until the time of Noah's grandsons. At least in those texts, I mean, in Jubilees and in Heiser, you have post-flood Nephilim, but they certainly completely die out at a certain point. Now, let's pause there for just a moment to point out that this is one of the papers that I wrote critiquing Heiser, is because in the Tanakh as a whole, right, in the Bible as a whole, you have 2 sentences about Nephilim, period, full stop. Okay, 2 sentences. And he was very open in admitting that he had neglected dealing with a full 50% of the biblical data on Nephilim. Okay, that's one sentence, but 1 out of 2. He admitted he didn't even bother dealing with Numbers 13:33, which is one of the sentences from the evil report, until he was basically pressured and critiqued into doing so. And it was that paper that he wrote in response to his critics that I wrote a rebuttal to. So then what happens? You have doctrine-wise, good teaching-wise, biblically, Nephilim are dead and gone with the flood. Okay. Centuries later, some guys merely assert that they saw them and God rebuked them. Then you have that, okay. Then centuries, if not millennia later, you get into the Second Temple era, And frankly, I don't know what those texts are, the pseudepigraphical text, in terms of we don't really know if they're meant to be historical fiction. I'm sure every author had their own motivation. Is it historical fiction? Is it pretenses at prophethood? Is it a pure folklore? Was it meant to be a fraud and a deception? Who knows what they were? But you have Jubilees, like I said, which has this interesting story about how post-flood somebody found the recipe for making Nephilim. And that's how you get post-flood Nephilim in that tale. Because, there's nothing like homemade Nephilim, you know what I mean? Right out of the oven, hot and fresh, right? And then you have first Enoch, right? AKA Ethiopic Enoch. And in that text, you do not have physical post-flood Nephilim. What it claims is that when Nephilim died, and in that text, they died from basically battling it out with each other, and I'm sure the last of them died in the flood. Then the assertion is that they became unclean spirits, which we could say are AKA demons. Okay, so now that is how you get this idea of a correlation between Nephilim and demons and how they can still be around, even if not physically. Now, grant you, there are pop researchers who claim that there's literally physical Nephilim still around. That's a whole separate issue. But this is how you get a text like Jubilees asserting physical post-flood Nephilim, but then when they die, they become unclean spirits, and also Enoch being just straight up that they didn't make it past the flood physically, but they made it past the flood spiritually, essentially. Now, I think that asserting that demons are the spirits of the Nephilim, I think it's a pretty good theory. It just doesn't really cut it, though. If you take into account all the biblical data, I think you can make a much stronger point that demons are disembodied fallen angels. They're the spirits of the physically incarcerated fallen angels. And if you're interested, you could just search online for my article, Demons Ex Machina, What Are Demons?, where I lay out why that's a much better theory. So this is why I initially said that we're not dealing with demons when it comes to the Genesis 6 affair, because demons actually did not even exist yet. It's Jude and Second Peter tell us that the fallen angels were incarcerated. So really, it wouldn't have been until that point that there was such a thing as unclean spirits or demons. So let me just say one more thing, because I know I've been kind of throwing a lot of talking points out. That's another thing I critique about Heiser, is the reason that he's claiming that unclean spirits or Nephilim or dead Nephilim spirits, is because thus saith folklore from centuries, if not millennia, after the Torah, right? The Jubilees asserts that, first Enoch asserts that, so Heiser merely picked it up and ran with it, just like he merely picked up and ran with the evil report. It's kind of like the same thing. It's a very bad modus operandi. And so what happens is that he makes what I would call a strictly linguistic argument, right? So first Enoch refers to them as unclean spirits, and in the New Testament, you could find references to unclean spirits. Therefore, they must be one and the same. It must be that they're carrying on that specific tradition that identifies what these beings are, where I would say that's strictly linguistic, though. That's not interacting with the very specific contexts that we're dealing with. That's why I think the context would be more along the lines of them being the spirits of fallen angels and not the spirits of Nephilim. So that's something that can be very subtle. You really have to be paying attention for people who make strictly linguistic arguments, because they sound very good and they can kind of take you along quite easily because the linguistics seem to match up. But when you start thinking about the specific narratives focus of any individual text, now you can realize, wait a minute, it doesn't quite work that way. It doesn't quite work. Does that make sense?
Yes. In a minute, if you can tell us about this evil report I never heard of, but
Okay.
another element that he popularized was this idea that there's many gods in heaven and many gods on the earth, and I know it comes from some type of weird trying to bring out the Trinity in the Hebrew scriptures, and then having a hierarchy of angels who are hanging out with God, and it almost becomes similar to the pantheon of the Canaanites. But he, similar to connects the gods of the nations to the demonology of ancient Israel. But I saw his followers go as far as making comic books about it and making fun of Buddha and other deities as reincarnations of these false gods and demons, and they're causing havoc, and everybody needs to be aware. So it just gets very convoluted and very pop culture, like you're saying, when he tries to kind of propagandize his beliefs and make some type of cosmology in relation to all these theories.
Yes, he would call it a form of cosmic geography, and that's actually an incredibly complicated subject. I can empathize with some of it, but one thing I try to be cautious about is watering things down, right? So, for example, I can't even tell you how many times I have very specifically written a comment about Nephilim, and somebody replies to me about giants. Okay, so I have to tell them, well, wait a minute, you moved the goalpost. I made a very specific reference to an ancient Hebrew word. You're replying with a vague, generic, subjective, and multi-usage modern day English word. So I don't even know if we're talking about the same thing anymore. You see, but this is something that the pop researchers do. I don't know if they do it purposefully or not, but for example, just giving entire lectures, entire videos, entire articles and books about giants without bothering to define what they mean by that term, and also using it to mean multiple things and leaving it up to the reader to try to figure out what they mean by it in any given usage. And incidentally, I could think about 6 different usages for that term. So that's what makes it kind of challenging. The excitement in this field of nephology is such that if you start poking around somebody's favorite tall tales, they tend to get really upset because they're just so excited by them, and because they are. But by the way, you mentioned the comic books, and it's very interesting too that virtually every single pop researcher has also published fictional works, including novels and comic books. And to me, it's no surprise because what they're claiming is nephology proper, biblical nephology. It's already unbiblical neo-theo sci-fi tall tale. So for them to just come right out and put out a work of admitted fiction, it's no stretch. Really, it's no stretch. They're already doing that anyway. But it is interesting. And it's gotten to the point where if you go to any bookseller website like Amazon and you type in something like Nephilim romance, dozens upon dozens upon dozens of dozens of novels. So this cottage industry is extremely lucrative, excuse me, well, except for people like myself. I always like to say the real difference between me and the pop researcher is that I'm not pop. Because of my views, I'm not getting invited to no conferences or to be interviewed by the big guys or have a lot of PR marketing behind my books because I'm just not going along with their party line. Basically, in Numbers chapter 13, you have the basically conclusion of the well, okay, what was supposed to be the conclusion of the Exodus, which is moving into the land of Canaan. And Moses is told to send out 12 spies to reconnoiter the land, right? So they're exploring the land and they come back. And the flow of the narrative is that a report is presented about the land. And it's the original report, it's accepted as is. And it points out that there's some 6 different people groups who are strong people groups, and they live in large, well-fortified cities. So this appears to cause concern in the Israelites, because the next thing you know, we have it that Caleb speaks up and he encourages the people. We can go, let's go possess it. We can overcome them. And then we end up finding out that Joshua sided with him. But the other 10 discourage the people and they say, no, we're not going to be able to go against it. They're stronger than us. Okay. Now, it's after this that the narrative very specifically tells us that they presented an evil report, or sometimes translated bad report, of the land. And it's therein that they present 5 mere assertions, none of which are backed by other biblical texts. And it's there that they not only contradict the original report, but they embellish it. Suddenly they say, oh, by the way, we saw Nephilim. Oh, and by the way, the Anakim are related to Nephilim. Oh, and by the way, the Nephilim are very, very, very tall. Like in comparison, we're like grasshoppers. And it's like, well, where are they getting this stuff? Well, obviously, like I said, logically, biologically, theologically, they're not getting it. They're just making it up. It's a tall tale. It's a scare tactic, fear-mongering tall tale to justify their fear of going in and taking the land, where they're going to have to confront 6 strong people groups living in well-fortified cities. Because if we start asking about how could there possibly be post-flood Nephilim, how could Anakim possibly be related to them, and why on earth are they very, very, very tall? It's like, well, we have no data upon which to back any of that. So it's pretty obvious that either these guys made up folklore on the spot, or who knows, maybe they were appealing to previous folklore about Nephilim. But one thing's for sure, there's nothing else that backs them. And there's a tremendous number of problems that arise from their assertions. And the end result is that God rebukes them. And, well, this wasn't a more moderated debate. We don't have a full transcript of the discussion, but it's simple. Like I said before, no one knows anything about Nephilim in the land or around the land, not in battles, not in hand-to-hand combat, nothing ever, period. End of story. And so that's the evil report. So when you start dipping your toes in this field of discussion, you'll find that Numbers 13:33 is the mother of all Nephilim texts, and people will appeal to it blindly, like they were literally just tell you, read this one single verse, don't bother interacting with the narrative, read this one verse, and that's why you should believe in post-flood Nephilim, and that they're really, really tall, because this one single sentence says that. And that's when you have to stop and say, well, wait a minute, didn't you read the narrative? Didn't you read the chapter? Didn't you read the Torah and the Tanakh as a whole? I mean, what makes you think that I should take these guys' words for it? I mean, they contradicted Moses, they contradict Caleb, they contradict Joshua, they contradict God, they contradict the whole entire rest of the Bible, because all of them admitted, of course, that there were Anakim in the land as well as other people groups. But none of them ever said one single word about Nephilim, ever, not once, period, end of story. So that's a major, major issue right there, is that one single sentence. Like I said, it's literally the sentence upon which all pop nephology is based. Post-flood nephology, and that Nephilim were really, really tall. That's where it comes from.
And real quick before we go into the break, what about Goliath, Og, all the different individuals? I know that the word Gibor or Giborim means mighty ones. Is that the word that is used for them, or is it in any way connected to giants?
No. So, of course, it depends on what you're reading. If you're reading standard English Bible, you're most likely going to be reading the word giant. But this is a problem in the English versions, is Nephilim will be rendered, not translated, by the way, rendered as giants. And guess what? Rephaim also is going to be rendered as giants. So when you're reading about Goliath being a quote unquote giant or Og being a quote unquote giant, it's not telling you anything about their height whatsoever. There's no implication of it. It's just merely telling you that they were Rephaim. And that happened because of the Greek Septuagint, for some strange reason, an unknown reason, rendered Nephilim and Giborim and Rephaim all as gigantes or gigas. And gigantes literally means earthborn. Okay, and gigas, okay, so giga, gigante, they're references to Gaia, the Greek goddess of earth, right? And so you're not going to get, this is called the word concept fallacy, right? If I say the word giant and you merely imagine height, that's a word concept fallacy. Because when it comes down to it, you're not going to get a word that describes the height of Nephilim from the Hebrew, nor the Greek, nor the English. That's not what those words are telling you. Nephilim, gigantes, and giants. It's telling you nothing about their height, nothing. You're getting that from the evil report, Numbers 1333, and you're just believing it. That's all there is to it.
Would like to discuss in the final segment of our show the Jewish interpretation of these texts. A lot of it that we've been discussing is the evangelical perspective. There's also the Catholic and Greek Orthodox, but I would like to know, how do Jews, after the destruction of the temple, saw these texts, and did they interpret them in a way that benefited their narrative, or was any mystical perspective suppressed as time progressed? We'll see you on the other side of the break. So we were just talking about how in Jewish circles, there's also, so we were talking about how in Jewish circles, there might be a different view. I know that the apocalyptic perspective that some people believe is where Jesus was speaking from was suppressed at later rabbinic times, from 150 on in the Common Era. Are you aware with how they interpreted these passages and how they saw the Raphaim, the Nephilim, they call they're the Amalekites, the people that Goliath was part of? How did they all get interpreted by later rabbinic sources?
Yeah, so that's a gigantic issue. Later rabbinic sources, that's a mouthful, because now we're not necessarily dealing with the text of the Torah or the Tanakh, right? We're dealing with rabbinic Judaism, which is a whole different animal, and there are various forms of, like you said earlier, it could be homiletics, it could be folklore, it could be actual attempts to strictly interpret a text. I mean, it's such a wide scope of phenomena and genre, actually, that is very, very difficult to answer. But taking a look right now at a chart that I provide at the very front of my book that's called On the Genesis 6 Affairs, Sons of God, Angels or Not. Okay, and so beginning with the Septuagint, LXX, the BCs and going forward in time almost a half millennia, one of the earlier rabbinic interpretations is that the sons of God, the Bnei Ha-Elohim in the Genesis 6 affair, were rulers or nobles. And apparently the terrible sin that was committed that served as the premise for the flood is that they married the hoi polloi, you know what I mean? Like the commoners. But of course, to me, that's just instantly dismissible because there's literally not a single word in the entire Tanakh about there being anything wrong with a noble person or a ruler, a king, or anything marrying a common person, right? That this sort of class warfare stuff doesn't exist in the Bible whatsoever, period. It's that simple. And so, like I said early on in the discussion, the majority view was the angel view. And that's just demonstrable. I mean, I literally have a chart that plots who took which view. We're talking from roughly 250 BC until 115, 202 BC. Or I'm sorry, we're into the AD now. You have basically no other view. And then continuing on, you still have barely any other different views than that up until the time of Augustine. So the angel view is just straight up the majority view. Now, the issue, like you said, I'm glad that you brought up the issue of how Rephaim and Anakim are viewed, because this is part of the watering down that I refer to, and I call it playing the name game. So when you're forced to confront the fact that the only post-flood biblical reference to Nephilim is from an unreliable guide who God rebuked, then the pop researchers just say, well, never mind that, because post-flood Nephilim were just referred to as Rephaim. Okay, now that's just playing a name game. It's just swapping things out. It's watering things down so that now you can pretend you have a lot more data points to play with when you actually don't. As far as Anakim, so let me put it this way. Nephilim, in my view, were strictly pre-flood hybrids. Rephaim were strictly post-flood, 100% humans, and Anakim were a clan of the Rephaim tribe. So Anakim are named after a man whose name was Anak, who is the son of Arba, and Rephaim had other AKAs, right? Like in Deuteronomy 2, you can see some people refer to Rephaim as Emim, some of them refer to him as Zamzumim, right? It's just different terms for this overarching, what I'm calling tribe, with Anakim being a clan. But while from the biblical text, you wouldn't imagine that they're anything but 100% human, and what we're told about them, incidentally, is that on average they're tall. Okay, the word tall is just as vague, generic, subjective, and multi-usage as the word giants. What does that mean? I mean, I'm tall compared to my wife, but that's by about 1.5 feet, right? So what does it mean that they were tall? Well, back in biblical days, in those times, the average Israelite male was roughly 5 feet, maybe 5.3. So anyone above that was tall. That doesn't really tell me anything. And so what happens is people then make up, and I'd be interested in what you think about this. People will then appeal to ancient Near East pagan myths about Rephaim, and they will then incorporate that into biblical theology. So, for example, in Ugaritic texts, when a king or a hero died, they were referred to as a king or a hero. But after they've been dead for a certain amount of time, then they're referred to by the Ugaritic equivalent of the term Repha or Rephaim. And then they could be summoned from the grave to appear at feasts or rituals or what have you. So that's why I'm saying that you have some people who appeal to that mythology and actually attempt to apply it to biblical theology, or I guess biblical or Rephiology, use that term. And this is where, again, I'm cautioning people to slow down and not just go with the flow and be careful about watering things down and playing name games. And it's one of the reasons that going multicultural, as I'll call it, is kind of unnerving to me, because you really, really have to slow down and make sure that, well, let me put it this way. A lot of the pop researchers and some scholarly ones present solid data points, okay? But the way they connect them is usually where the problem is. So they're connecting them according to some kind of worldview or tall tale that they want to support. And so that's why it's easy to fall for this kind of fast talking stuff, because you're saying, well, but these data points are solid. Well, yes, the issue is how they're being connected. It's just like I was saying before about the strictly linguistic arguments, right? The data points are solid, but they're being connected strictly linguistically, regardless of the context of any given narrative, right? So this is where you would end up with statements in the Talmud Bavli, right? The Babylonian Talmud, and various midrashim about how, well, the Anakim wore the sun as a necklace. Boy, they must have some really, really strong sunblock on their skin, I got to tell you. This is where you end up with, as time goes on, Nephilim and whatever, Rephaim, Anakim just get progressively taller and taller and taller and taller until there's folklore about taking hours or days to walk the length of one of their bones, all these things that are just obviously folklore, great folklore, just fantastic. For instance, First Enoch has Nephilim being 3,000 ells tall, and that equals miles, okay? So it has them being miles tall. It's great folklore. It is. It's poor reality, but it's a fun story. The problem with modern nephology is you have people taking this stuff seriously, and not only seriously, deadly seriously. So, for example, in my book, Nephilim and Giants as per pop researchers, I ended up writing a chapter that was very disturbing for me to write, and I titled it Nephil Kampf, right? Some might recognize that word from Hitler's book, Mein Kampf. Well, I wrote Nephil Kampf as a chapter because some of these pop researchers are going as far as saying that because Nephilim are still around, and by the way, conveniently, they look exactly like human beings, which biblically they would. But remember, these guys first tell us a tall tale about how they're very, 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 very tall. So if you ask them, well, where are they? They say, well, I can't show you a very, 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 very tall Nephilim because they've shrunk down. And we are going to have to battle them, right? We are going to have to engage in hand-to-hand combat with these Nephilim and wipe them out, like in modern days, okay? And these guys are deadly serious about this, and it's so, so scary to me. Stephen Quayle, for instance, the plagiarist, incidentally, telling us about how we're going to have to shoot them down with copper-tipped arrows. I mean, the specificity is disturbing that somebody would put so much thought into a tall tale and teach people that the way to identify a Nephil in the modern day is that they look just like a human and you're going to have to wipe them out. I mean, that is unbelievably disturbing. But this is as far as these guys go when people start accepting what's really a delusion. There's really no other way to put it, unfortunately.
Well, speaking of Germanic occult ideas, one thing that worried me about Heiser's methodology was in one of his podcasts, he was saying that he was a big fan of the German theologians, and a lot of them were pre-Nazi anti-Semites or anti-Judaic theologians. And then, like you were saying, a lot of the ideas, ways to interpret scripture came from the cultures that were around the Israelites, and there is a correlation with the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, but this obsession with everything of ancient Judaism coming from a different source, me, it gives me the hint that they're trying to say that it's hodgepodge from a different cultures and different worldviews, and that the Jews somehow distilled it into monotheism. And to me, it's very condescending. It's that Jews can never come up with anything. So you have to look at what the Babylonians were doing for exorcism, and what the Egyptians were doing for the afterlife, and what the Assyrians were thinking about dualistic ideas. And then that's how you make sense of Jewish concepts as compared to looking at Jewish interpretation or even Jewish understanding. He did some of that with the pseudepigrapha and the other texts that were, around the Second Temple, but it just the Apocrypha. But it just seems like there's this desire to make it more universal, and then in the process, it starts throwing the whole thing out as a compilation instead of being noble and unique to the Israelites.
Right, and actually, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that is not only an extremely important thing to think and talk about, but it is fairly complex. So, for instance, yes, there's this idea that we Israelites were just tabula rasa, right? We were like complete blank slates, and as we traveled from Egypt through to the Canaan and they're around, we were just picking up, hey, we like this, we'll take that from your culture, and we don't like that, we'll reject that from yours, and we'll take this and incorporate it to that. Of course, there is a certain amount of interaction with these other cultures. How could there not be? You're living your daily life interacting with these peoples, and you're listening to their ancient mythologies and legends. So, of course, there's some interaction, but to say that, therefore, like you said, that there's nothing that's uniquely Israelite, that there's no direct revelation to them, that's a whole other story. So let me just take a step back to maybe categorize what I think we're really talking about, which is that pre-flood, you had humanity living in relative proximity, right? And so everyone had this shared history. After the flood, and let me jump ahead specifically to the time of the Tower of Babel, you have dispersal of humanity further across the world. And so you have people groups dividing from each other, taking with them what was then real and shared history, and eventually, with time and telling and embellishment, you end up with what's called myth and legend, right? And so this is why the most ancient cultures in the world, pretty much regardless of where they are, they have certain basic shared features in their most ancient histories or myths and legends. It's because they came from real things. What bothers me is this just happened today. I was in a comment section and somebody was saying, well, look at that statue of Gilgamesh. He's holding a full-grown lion in his arm like it's a kitten. And I said, well, hold on. I think the first thing we need to think about is why should we take an ancient sculpture literally? I mean, can we at least begin there? Yes, I know it's a sculpture of Gilgamesh who's allegedly 16 feet tall holding a full grown lion like it's a kitten, but can we at least just begin by thinking about whether we should take that literally or not? Is that too much to ask? Is it too skeptical to just beg for just a little bit of common sense and then maybe take it from there to see if we end up in the land of, here be giants? Am I asking too much?
Finish up. What is your view regarding ongoing revelation or mystical stuff? Because if you take a completely rational approach, a lot of the miracles and even possibilities of angels becoming corporeal and having relations with women can be interpreted in a way that it was an allegory, a metaphor, a dream. I think of Maimonides' perspective that a lot of the stuff that is described in the Bible is almost educational or didactical. So why is it that in the early chapters of the Bible, there's a lot of stuff that people would consider mythical, and then you go later on, and if you start dismissing the mystical perspective, then a lot of the things are not as spectacular. So where are you left with all this stuff? I think that's why Heiser would say that the spirit of the Nephilim came back as the unclean demons that were getting into people when Jesus showed up, and they were fighting over, his messiahship. So if that stuff wasn't really there, then what happened? Like, why is the modern man not able to tap into those miraculous perspectives, including having individuals who have had interactions with supernatural beings, and then are supernatural beings still visiting us, all that kind of stuff?
Well, let me begin with the statement about angels. I think you said you put it in the way of angels becoming corporeal to mate with humans. So that would not actually be biblical angelology, because biblically angels are always described as looking just like human males and performing physical actions with no indication that that's not their ontology. In other words, there's no indication that they are something different, and then all of a sudden they take on somehow a human looking physical body. It's the opposite. It's that is how they look naturally. That's just how they were created. And in the Psalms, we're told that we humans were created a little lower than them. This is also a field in which you have watering down and the name game, because then people will come at me with like, well, wait a minute, angels do have wings and angels don't look like humans, because cherubim and seraphim have wings and don't look like humans. This is where we have to say, hold on a minute now. By definition, cherubim and seraphim are not angels. If they were angels, then they would be angels. There's at least three different ways to distinguish angels, cherubim, and seraphim. Those are just three different categories of being. So we can't just water them all down and mash them together just because centuries after the Tanakh and millennia after the Torah, somebody decided to do that. No, that's not legitimate.
Again, we want to thank Ken Ami for being on the show. We were discussing the phenomenon of the Nephilim, the so-called giants mentioned in scripture that have been interpreted by different groups differently, and we're trying to get to the bottom line of what is said in the book of Genesis. We hope we can have you on the show in the future to discuss other topics. This is Raiders of the Unknown. We'll be back next week with another episode. as part of the Mystic Skeptic radio show and podcast. Thank you.